Hi, I'm Philia Steyn and I'm the Safari expert. And this week I thought I'd talk to you a little bit more about Canon's R6 and R7 mirrorless cameras. We'll talk a little bit about how they compare and more specifically which one I think is best for wildlife and nature photography. Now, I've been using the Canon R6 for almost a year now and I absolutely love it. So I've been able to test it a lot out in the field. I have to mention though that I haven't yet gotten my hands on an R7. There's still a waiting list here in South Africa, but it is quite easy to compare the specifications of the two cameras and to give you some good advice when it comes to choosing the right one for you. Now, these two cameras are very similar in many ways. They've got Canon's excellent build quality, the layout is very similar, and they've got great battery life. And they also have Canon's advanced autofocus systems as well as in-camera stabilization. So I'm not going to spend too much time on those similarities. I'd like to talk to you about 4 big differences that might help you make a decision to lean one way or the other. And those 4 things are the price, the sensor, the ISO capabilities, and then lastly, and very importantly, the frames per second that it can photograph at. Now let's start with the price. You would have seen that there's a massive price difference between the Canon R6 and the Canon R7. The R6 comes in at about $2,500 which I've always thought is a little bit expensive. And the R7's price is about $1,000 cheaper at around $1,500. And I think that's actually very reasonable. So I always say to people, the best camera for you, no matter what you photograph, is the one that you can afford. So price definitely plays a very, very big role. So for some of you, the Canon R6 will definitely be outside your budget, especially for those of you that still have to buy a lens as well. So if price is a really big limiting factor for you, you might have to look into buying the Canon R7. Now these prices are very much what we saw with the DSLRs. The Canon R6 pretty much replaces the full frame Canon 5D Mark IV DSLR. Their prices are very similar. And then the R7 will replace the 7D Mark II DSLR. And again, the prices are quite similar. So you might be wondering, why is the R7 so much cheaper than the R6? Well, the first thing is they've got very different sensors. The Canon R6 has a full frame sensor, whereas the Canon R7 has an APS-C sensor. In other words, it's a crop factor sensor that basically increases the focal length by 1.6. So essentially that makes 100 to 400 a 160 to 640 millimeter lens, or it makes your 150 to 600 millimeter lens something like a 240 to a 960 millimeter lens. Now, why is this important to take into consideration? Well, if you're like me and you like photographing a lot of wider scenes or animals in the environment, it's good to use a full frame camera. And that's exactly why I went for the R6. It means that when you zoom out with those longer telephoto lenses, like 100 to 400, you are actually photographing at 100 millimeters and therefore getting more of the scene in. Like I just said, if you put that 100 to 400 on the R7, the widest will be 160 millimeters, and that might just not be wide enough. Now, some of you might like photographing landscapes when you're out in nature, and in that case, a full frame camera is definitely a must. Not only because, again, you don't want that cropping in when you zoom out to the widest, but also full frame sensors just handle low light so much better. And a lot of our landscape photographs are done either or at dawn or dusk, or sometimes even after dark when we're photographing the stars. Crop sensor cameras just don't work particularly well with astrophotography because they don't perform particularly well in very dark conditions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I speak about the ISO. One other thing that's important to mention when we talk about the sensor is the size of it, because there's quite a big difference. The Canon R6 has a very small sensor. It's just over 20 megapixels in size, whereas the Canon R7 has one that's just over 30 megapixels, so quite substantially larger. And what that does, it allows you more sort of freedom to crop the photograph after you've taken it. So not only have you got more cropping ability with the R7, but again, also that 1.6 magnification that I spoke to you about. So for someone that's photographing things that are very far away, or subjects that are very small like birds, the Canon R7 is really a good bet. On my R6, I sometimes feel a little bit short because my 100 to 400 is 100 to 400 because it doesn't have that built-in crop factor. But also, I can't really crop a lot because I don't want to take any additional pixels away from that small 20 megapixel sensor. So If you're a landscape photographer or you like photographing animals in their environment a lot, the R6 is a great option. If you're photographing animals in places where they're far away from you, in my area that would typically be a national park like the Kruger National Park or the Kalahari Transfrontier Park, or you do a lot of bird photography where they're quite far away from you and quite small, the R7 is a better option. But having said that, wait until I talk a little bit more about the frames per second when you make that decision. If you ask me, that small 20 megapixel sensor of the R6 is probably its biggest disadvantage. I really wish it was just a little bit larger. But luckily, the quality of the photographs from that full frame sensor on the R6 is absolutely amazing. It's equal, if not better, to my Canon 5D Mark IV DSLR that I used to use. Now, as with all APS-C sensors, those crop factor sensors, I can't imagine that the Canon R7's quality will be better than that of the R6. Now, talking about image quality, let's go over to the next thing, and that's ISO. Now, when we look at the Canon R6, it's got a very big ISO range from 100 all the way to just over 100,000. Whereas with the Canon R7, it only goes from 100 to 32,000. Now, that's not a big surprise to me. We typically have that big difference between the full frame cameras and the crop factor cameras. So like what we had with the 5D Mark IV versus the 7D Mark II. And the reason for that is if they made the ISO capabilities of the R7 as good as they did for the R6, no one would pay that extra money to buy it. But what it means in reality is that the R6 full frame camera is going to handle low light better than the R7, or at least that's my gut feeling. Again, I haven't tested it in the field, but looking at that big ISO difference or range difference, I can almost guarantee that to you. So it just means that if you use the R7 crop factor camera early in the morning, late afternoon, or after dark, you're going to start seeing grain earlier than you would when you use the Canon R6. You just won't be able to photograph at such high ISO values. Now, for me, that does a lot of nighttime photography, photographing leopards, lions, and other nocturnal creatures. I love the R6 for the fact that it handles low light as good as it does. But if you think you're going to photograph animals mostly during the day, maybe you're photographing in national parks where you're not allowed to go out at night, or you're doing a lot of bird photography that's often done in good light conditions, the R7 will be absolutely fine. Now, we've looked at price, we've looked at the sensors and how they differ, as well as the camera's ISO capabilities. But let's talk about the one thing that I think is the most important thing to consider when you decide between the R6 and the R7. And that's the camera's frame rates. Now, both cameras allow you to shoot either with a mechanical shutter where you can actually hear the shutter roll over, or an electronic shutter that's completely silent. And on the R6, your mechanical shutter count is 12 frames per second and 20 frames per second for the electronic shutter, which is already very impressive. But on the R7, it's a full 15 frames per second mechanically and 30 frames per second on the electronic shutter. Now, that really is very impressive, and you may have looked at those figures and thought to yourself, wow, that really is enough reason to buy the R7. But what you have to consider is the size of the camera's buffer. In other words, how long can you keep the shutter down before it stops taking photographs at those high frame rates? On the Canon R6, you can photograph up to 240 images in RAW, which I think you should always use before that fast frame rate starts slowing down. And that's both for the mechanical and the electronic shutter modes. On the Canon R7, the news, unfortunately, is not that good. If you use the mechanical shutter at 15 frames per second, you will actually reach the limit after only 51 RAW photographs. And when you're photographing in the electronic mode, where you photograph at 30 frames per second, you actually reach that limit of RAW photos after only 41 images. That means you're literally only photographing that fast for just over a second. So what that basically means is you've got this incredibly fast frame rate, but you have to press the button at exactly the right time, when the bird takes off or the leopard leaps or whatever action it is you're photographing. For me, that kind of defeats the object of this incredible fast frame rate, because what if I want to photograph a bird in flight and I want to track it and photograph it for 4 or 5 seconds? You simply can't do that effectively with a Canon R7. Does that mean it's not worth buying the Canon R7? I don't necessarily think so. So let's end off by talking who I think should buy the R7 versus the R6 for wildlife and nature photography. If you're expecting to photograph a lot of action a lot of the time, I think the R7's issue with that frame rate, or the fact that you can't photograph a lot of photos in short succession, is a big issue, and you should rather look at getting the R6. But if you're photographing animals in good light over a great distance and you want to extend that length of your already long zoom lens, I think the R7 is a great option, especially considering how much cheaper it is than buying an R6. But if you're photographing animals in low light and you like taking them in their environment and image quality is extremely important to you, especially after dark, then I think the R6 is the camera to go for. If you want to see some great reviews about these two cameras in the field, go and check out the Pangolin Photo Safaris channel, where I know they put them through their paces along the Chobe River. I'll add some links to those videos in the description as well. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and ask me any questions you might have about the Canon R6 or even the R7 in the comments below. Until next time.